Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to today's IWFM webinar, Navigating Turbulent Times, on the theme of future-proofing facilities, climate adaptation for workplace and facilities managers. This is to celebrate and discuss the recent publication of our climate resilience guidance that has been produced in association with Equans, Climate Adaptation for WFM. We have an hour today in our webinar to talk through the various aspects of climate adaptation, as well as some real world examples of where that's been implemented in workplaces and workspaces as well. I'm Andrew Gladstone Heighton. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm the Policy and Research Manager here at IWFM. Today, we will have a few moments for introduction and housekeeping, and I'll ask each of the panelists as I introduce them to come and say hello and come on camera so you know you could put a name to a face. Then we will pass over to James Heritage, who will talk us through the key points covered in the guidance notes. James is, as you can see there, the Climate Risk and Adaptation Manager at Equans UK and Ireland, and is the author of our report. So we're very grateful to have James on the call. Then we'll have 20 minutes or so for a structured conversation and question and answer. So you will see on the bottom of your Zoom screen that there is an opportunity to contribute questions through the Q&A function. I would encourage you to do that, place them in the chat, and my team will help ensure that we cover any questions that are coming in as well. Then we'll have a presentation from Peter Leighton-Jones on climate adaptation in the context of a large public service body, the Mid Yorkshire Teaching NHS Trust. And then a further conversation, to perhaps responding to some of the points raised in that. And then a quick closing on recommendations and key takeaways for WFM. So you'll be leaving today with some ideas that you can implement straight away after today's session. The slides and the webinar recording will be shared with you afterwards. So there is opportunity there to share this with colleagues who may find it useful. Okay, so let's get into it. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Anna Williamson. Anna, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Andrew, for teeing that up. It's a pleasure to be on the call today. I am a practitioner and an academic. I teach at the University of the Built Environment, but I also lead the Level 6 degree apprenticeship at the University of Gloucestershire in FM. So it's a pleasure to look at climate adaptation. My specialism is in sustainability, and I am a practitioner in that field as well, and understand what that really means for the FM, and take some of this best practice guidance that we're going to hear today and learn how to operationalise it. So great to be here. Thank you.
I'll introduce myself next. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's James Heritage. I'm a Climate Risk and Adaptation Manager for Equans. I work in a team that specifically looks at the impacts of climate risk, how to mitigate those risks, and how organisations can adapt accordingly. I work alongside engineers who specialise in decarbonisation, energy savings efficiencies, and we're really a strategic partner for navigating climate risk and providing operational resilience. I've worked in the FM space for almost 14 years now, in and around it, seen a significant amount of change when it's come to sustainability. And I've always had a passion for understanding sort of like the impacts of climate on operations. And in the past couple of years, I've worked specifically within that space. I think it's great that there's a growing emphasis on climate adaptation in our sectors now. And we're taking it seriously, and that's really great. And that provides us with an opportunity to accelerate the sustainability of our buildings and safeguard them well into the future. I'm really looking forward to introducing the climate adaptation guidance note today that I wrote in conjunction with my colleague Josie Naramore, and running you through some of those highlights. Thank you.
I can't hear you, Andrew. I don't know if it's just me, but I'll introduce myself. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Peter Leighton-Jones. I work for Mid Yorkshire Teaching NHS Trust, which is a a mid-tier acute hospital trust. I've been here for 4.5 years now, but prior to that, I was in local government for 17 years in a myriad of different sustainability related roles. I'm a generalist, I think you could describe me as, but I'm tasked with delivering the net zero program for my organization. But that has mutated into a more holistic viewpoint, I suppose, of sustainability to encapsulate climate adaptation. And I think it has been the missing part of the jigsaw puzzle so far. The focus has very much been on carbon abatement for obvious reasons, but no matter what we do now, climate change impacts are going to be felt long into the future, and they are going to worsen. And I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of actually implementing the changes needed to address those quite severe impacts. So yeah, I'm going to talk about some of my experiences and where I think some of the pitfalls lie at the moment. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. Hopefully you can hear me now. Apologies, it's not the rabbits eating through my Ethernet cable today. It just must be the bit of damn string that connects County Durham to the rest of the UK. James, over to you to walk us through the sort of key findings and really talk about this climate adaptation guidance and bring it to life for us. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah. So firstly, I'd just like to say how pleased Equans were to publish this guidance note in conjunction and collaboration with IWFM. It's really important to us that the FM industry, public sector partners, private sector partners have the right type of access to educational resources to mitigate the risks of climate change and to make our built environment more sustainable well into the future. And if we, Equans, can be part of that supportive journey, then that's something that we can be really proud of, actually. So that's great. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to cover off some of the key points of the guidance note. I'm going to talk you through them. And my aim is to equip us, workplace professionals, facilities managers, and others with a high level understanding of climate adaptation and its growing relevance in the built environment. So first off, the guidance note asks a real key question. What is climate adaptation? None of us are blind to the fact that the UK's climate has changed. The Met Office has confirmed that in most recent decades, our weather and climate has become warmer, wetter, and sunnier than the 20th century. Climate adaptation is really the process of adjusting to those changes in our climate and the effects that they can cause. And those effects, although causing risk, can also be moments of opportunity where we reassess and we do things better. So adaptation is really about reducing our risk, reducing our exposure to climate risks. So then the guidance note after that talks about understanding climate risks. So that's kind of like our next job. So what are climate risks specifically? So climate risks are those things that have a negative impact on human and natural systems that arise from climate change. And they can be grouped into two specific risk categories. So there's the physical risk. So these can be like acute weather events or rapid onset events like river or surface flooding, storms, droughts, heat stress in terms of the heat waves that we experience. And then there can be chronic risks as well. And these can be much more slow onset, like water ingress or subsidence, or in terms of heat stress, again, the gradual mean temperature rise that we're experiencing globally and very much so in Europe. So these physical risks, they have an impact on the built environment. They can damage building fabric, disrupt operations, increase maintenance and energy consumption costs, while also impacting occupant health and safety and productivity within those buildings as well. Then the next category of risk is kind of those transitional risks. So these are the risks that arise from a shift towards a low carbon economy and probably our realization that we need to adapt to climate as well. So that means things like policy and regulation change, shifts in technology, changes in the marketplace, reputational risks. and supply chain disruption due to things like extreme weather or regulation again. The guidance note then looks at the impacts on the built environment. So really the built environment is at the forefront of climate change due to its exposure to these physical and transitional risks. And it's also worth considering that the impact of climate risks will never be spread evenly across markets or geographies. So this means that adaptation strategies and the actions as well, they've got to be really bespoke to the environment that the building sits within, even down to the individual assets within those buildings and the services within those buildings as well. They've got to be really bespoke types of adaptation within a building environment. One really interesting anecdote, I think, to demonstrate this is that in the City of London, there are two buildings that are really, really close to each other. They were built in the same year. They were designed by the same architect. And during the July 2022 heatwave, one of those buildings lost the ability to run its services. And this was purely down to the placement of its IT infrastructure. The hardware was exposed to a significant amount of heat stress and it failed. Whereas the other building, very, very close to it, we're talking meters away, remained operational. And that's because they had their IT equipment in a different location, but they also had the correct cooling equipment in place as well. So I think that really sort of demonstrates how changes are within very close environments, but they're so unique to individual buildings and environments. So the guidance note then sort of asks us, like, what's the role of facilities management and workplace managers with regard to climate adaptation? Well, climate adaptation really presents an opportunity for us to make our buildings and our workplaces more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And we, as workplace and FM professionals, can be the first line of defense against the climate risks. We have really detailed knowledge of buildings. We have really detailed knowledge of operations. And we can position ourselves, and we do, as a strategic cog within that. So we inform forward planning, we inform investment choices, we have the ability to adjust planned preventative maintenance, and that will reduce reactive repairs. That will in turn minimize service disruption and loss, and hopefully we hope that will improve the health, safety and well-being of our building occupiers and the users of our services. So by proactively planning and implementing adaptation measures, we can increase resilience and reduce disruption within the workplace, and we have a responsibility to do that as well. So following on from that, the climate adaptation guidance note looks at some of the key principles for adaptation planning within our workspaces. So when we're incorporating these measures into the built environment, we really should follow some key principles. They will help us understand risk, identify funding opportunities that are required. They'll ensure that any type of adaptation planning works in collaboration with other strategies that you'll have in place, such as decarbonisation strategies and requirements. So firstly, we need to risk assess and vulnerability map the critical sort of elements of the climate risks that the building are exposed to. So we need to identify the hazards, analyze our exposure to each of those hazards, and present findings back. And what impact will that have on sort of things like service disruption and then fabric damage to mechanical and electrical assets within the building. Secondly, we need to go on our journey using the right type of data that will inform our decisions really well. So climate data can provide probable scenarios and help us map these hazards as well. So you need that element, but then you kind of need the elements that we have access to on site as well. So it's really site specific. So looking at data sets with a historic view of experienced hazards and potential vulnerabilities, you have access to those. So these can be things like asset registers, CAFAM data, BMS data. So combining these two together, the climate data and the building data, we can start looking at like the financial impact and analysis, and then we can start thinking about specific targeted action to incorporate within a building or within a site. And when considering those actions, it's really critical to understand what your return on investment is and could be. And you've got to scrutinize that really well through obviously robust governance processes. But we need to consider what change will cost, how savings are realized, and align it with wider strategic goals so that they're understood and incorporated as well. A key strategic goal, your decarbonisation targets, that's really got to be really well considered. You've got balanced adaptation actions with your emissions reduction, because otherwise you want to avoid any type of maladaptation, bad adaptation planning that may not do what we say it will in a few years' time. Because poorly planned adaptation that might prioritize things like cost over effectiveness can really undermine climate resilience and our sustainability goals as well. So we need to put real scrutiny upon these actions and ensure that we're incorporating decarb and we get a good return on investment throughout. The guidance note offers towards the end a lot of practical actions. There's a significant amount of action that can be taken right now. There's things like digital monitoring of assets, of utilities that we can incorporate. There are nature-based solutions that we can incorporate into our sites, all the way through to the replacement of aging mechanical and electrical assets. Whereas if you get new ones in, it will really help you reduce your energy consumption, and that can be a form of adaptation as well. In fact, the guidance note has a really good section on some of the practical steps that can be taken now on your adaptation journey. I think there's like 9 steps in all. So have a look at that. It's really, really useful. And we can start embedding resilience into how we operate. So consider all of these steps in conjunction with business continuity, procurement strategies, and perhaps most critically, we need to take our stakeholders around us on this journey as well. We need to really nail the purpose of climate adaptation to them and why it is so important. And we can do that through clear communication to them. And then once we kind of got them on board and we implement some of these actions, it's going to be really, really important to cascade those learnings up and down the infrastructure of organizations, learnings within the building, so that our building occupiers have access to it, so they understand what we're doing within those spaces. I think ultimately the core message for and from this guidance note is that climate risks are already impacting our built environment, and we as workplace and FM professionals have an opportunity and a responsibility to incorporate those actions into our buildings and do that sustainably. So done properly, we'll safeguard our buildings into the future great. We'll promote occupancy, safety and well-being, and will ensure business continuity as well. Really quick whistle stop to tour through the guidance note. I'll hand back to Andrew now.
Thank you so much, James. Wow, so much you've outlined there that is included in the guidance note. And as there will be a link to the guidance note at the end of today's webinar. It is free to download for members, so I would encourage, as James has said, all of you to please visit that and think about that process that James outlined. We have an opportunity for Q&A now, so I'll bring in our other panel members. Just as a reminder, delegates on the call, there's a little Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type in any questions you have for James, Anna or Peter there. And whilst you're thinking about questions to ask, we talked about the different aspects of climate adaptation, the health and safety, safety of occupants, the cost. How would you go about prioritizing that if you're looking at climate resilience for a particular building? What sort of triage process would you go through, James?
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about like a decision that is cost driven versus a sort of a risk driven decision, I suppose that it can seem a little bit chicken and egg to start off with, but I think what it really boils down to within the first instance is making an informed, correct decision specifically for your business. So as mentioned, when you have like a business case, when you're outlining that within your organization, you need to look at the strategies around you as well. You need to start understanding, having the knowledge of your exposure to risk, what the physical risks are for a building, what the transitional risks are for the organization, and consider your own tolerances to those risks. And through that process, you'll be able to discover sort of suitable adaptation interventions. I think, yeah, it's really about aligning the solutions that you're putting in place with your organization strategies, and investment cases need to be proportionate and they need to be sustainable as well. And I suppose if you do some of the due diligence and if you do some of the activities outlined in the guidance note and you're still feeling that you're lacking knowledge, then that's probably worth getting some sort of specialist advisor into the conversation from that point on as well. So it's just about kind of, a cost versus risk and understanding your risk tolerance, I suppose.
Fantastic, and thank you very much. We do have a comment in from a delegate saying the decision point for adaptation is tricky. For example, less than 5 years ago, CHP was an effective tool. This is no longer the case. I think this speaks to sort of different models and different evaluation methods. So, question to anyone on the panel: how do we reach that decision point? What's the best way to structure that and to go through that process James outlined? And again, feel free to bring in any examples that have worked in the past. Peter.
Yeah, I think one area that is a bit of a paradox is cooling. So, for example, all of our sites now are cooling deficient because the world has changed. It's very costly to install new cooling retrospectively as a retrofit. But not only that, it also increases your carbon emissions, and there's a revenue implication as well, because of the electrical load that it's introducing to the site. But it has to be done. So squaring that circle is quite difficult, I think, sometimes. And speaking to what James just said in response to the previous question as well, I do think it's quite difficult to create business cases around some of these aspects because it's quite esoteric, isn't it? It's pretty mysterious in terms of what the actual financial impact will be in the future. You can kind of articulate it and say, yes, it would be a diseconomy not to take action, but we don't really think like that within public sector organizations. We generally have 1 year budgets that are renewed each and every year. So having like a 5, 10, or even 20-year outlook is really difficult. And if you put that in front of a chief financial officer and give them a risk that's completely unbounded and impossible to quantify, it is quite a difficult selling point, I think, to get that business case over the line. I take the point about CHP as well, because we were planning to do that in one of our other hospital sites. We've got it in one, which is Dewsbury, that campus, and it is very useful when it works because it gives you added resilience. But of course, it's a different world now, and you would just be introducing new fossil fuels into the system that would be difficult to retrofit at a later date.
Fantastic, Peter. Thank you. And yes, the public sector is particularly exposed with those sort of shorter funding envelopes, as you say, often only sort of 12 months in advance. Anna, would you like to have an answer?
Thank you. I'm just hearing the precautionary principle. You know, the fact is that there isn't one job that we do on a building that doesn't initiate or need 10 more jobs to be done. And I'm reminded of CHP in a building in London where the sustainability certification scheme really rewarded the installation of a peanut oil CHP. They got all the green certification, and that CHP actually it was commissioned but never used because the supply chain to get that particular material was just so fraught. And actually, when we do expand, as Peter opened with, the discussion around climate adaptation and sustainability beyond just carbon, and then we need to look at our supply chains and need to look at where we're bringing our kit from There's great turbulence at the moment in supply chains, in global supply chains, and in maintenance chains as well. And one point that I'd like to circle back to, and I'm sure we will later on, is I am always advocating for the FM to be the Chief Sustainability Officer in any organisation, and to be able to have this view in the round as opposed to what is directly in front of them at this moment, I think is absolutely key.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, and I think that point around supply chains is particularly salient at the moment. Do any of you have any worked examples? Anna, you pointed out that the risk to a supply chain there of a specific product. How can we de-risk climate-related threats to supply chains, especially where we are using quite long supply chains or from other parts of the world?
Well,
Peter? Sorry. Sorry, Peter and then Anna.
Yeah, I think we need to reverse the decisions of the past in terms of offshoring industry to elsewhere. That is what has exposed us to risks ultimately. So a manufacturing base back in this country would be the way that you would address some of those things. Obviously, you'd still be reliant on raw materials from elsewhere, but it would help to mitigate risk to a certain extent. I'm thinking of things, for example, like food. So I was going to discuss this in my presentation, but this is an opportune moment anyway. So I do fear a global crop failure event at some point in the future, or even localized ones within the UK. We currently import 60% of our food. So there's an issue there. And I think we are exposed to a lot of risks because of the decisions that we've made around manufacturing and producing goods, because obviously it was cheaper to offshore that. And it ties into the carbon dynamic as well, because the reason that we've done so well from a carbon emissions reduction perspective, or one of the reasons, is because we don't manufacture things anymore. So our scope 1 and 2 emissions have become scope 3 emissions overseas. And we've exploited cheap labor to do that. So I do think there is more we can do to look at tightening up our supply chains and bringing them back in-house within the confines of the country.
A larger structural change there, Peter, as well, I think, as well. Anna, really quick, and then we'll pass over to Peter for his section, because I know, sneaking a look at his slides, as you say, there's quite a few of these themes woven throughout. But Anna, over to you.
Just acknowledging what Peter's just said there is localism, not isolationism per se, but localism definitely, without becoming isolated in the global network, really, and just an acknowledgement that some of these certification schemes that we do adhere to, and they are beneficial in terms of regulation and legislation and our mission and vision as a business. They're not one size fits all. What fits for city centre London needn't fit for Madrid, needn't fit for Glasgow. And we need to have I would welcome a debate around what local certification, pragmatic certification looks like, working with natural systems, and by that I mean weather systems and environmental systems as well, just to acknowledge what James opened with two distinct buildings not very far apart from each other, but very different operationally. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna. We've got questions coming in, which is brilliant. We will put a pin in those for the later Q&A. But for now, Peter, can I pass over to you to talk through examples from, as you say, public sector body and with I assume, a large estate over many sites?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So just to give you some context, I suppose, as to what Mid Yorkshire Teaching NHS Trust looks like. So we operate out of 3 hospital campuses, effectively. So one of them is Pinderfields, which is in Wakefield. That's the largest hot site, so to speak. So that's got a very busy ED department. Then we've got Dewsbury Hospital and also Pontefract. Dewsbury's in the middle, really. Pontefract is more of an urgent treatment centre with some capacity for operations as well and some outpatient services. But we employ 11,000 members of staff, so we're quite a large employer. We've got 1,000 beds for inpatients. I think it's 60,000 operations per year and 600,000 outpatient appointments are fairly large, and the budget is around 700 million a year. So that's goods and services, staffing costs, and also the capital program. So yeah, quite a large estate. And the reason I was asked to do this is because we've got a relationship with Equans. They provide our hard FM services at 2 of the hospital sites, which are PFI, so private finance initiative. So we have worked quite closely with them over the last few years on quite a lot of sustainability related projects that we do. If you can move to the next slide, please. So yeah, just to give some context, I suppose, me and my peers, so other sustainability professionals within the NHS, both centrally and from a decentralized perspective in terms of individual trusts, we're well aware that the climate emergency is a health emergency as well. We can see the cross linkages. You might not be able to see the text on that particular slide, but it really just goes through some of the impacts. So at the moment, we are doing a climate risk vulnerability assessment, which I'm sure a lot of other organisations are doing too. Some of you might have already completed that process. I do think the NHS has been slightly behind the curve as compared to some other public sector bodies. One thing I do think is that it has been a bit parochial to date in terms of heatwave planning, is this sort of prevalent strand that people tend to look at. So we do have a well-established business continuity plan around heatwave planning. I think it is missing some key components at the moment, it's fair to say, because of what I've said around the cooling deficiencies. So in the event of a heat wave, there isn't that much you can do, given the infrastructure that we have. So you can bring in temporary cooling, but it's very inefficient and costly. One of the suggestions, believe it or not, is to give ice lollies to members of staff and also patients, but I don't think that is a solution per se. Something more tangible needs to be done. And looking back to 2022, when we had that unprecedented heat wave in July, and I think there was another event in August, some of the internal temperatures that I saw were well in excess of 30 degrees Celsius, which is unbearable to work in, but it's also a safety concern for patients. So something certainly will need to be done in the near term to avoid those types of eventualities. I'm also trying to get people to understand the bigger picture at the moment. So I don't think they can wrap their heads around the fact that global supply chain disruption is a very real threat. So when we think about medicines and medical equipment, like I said previously, we don't really manufacture things anymore to the extent that we once did. So we're completely reliant on those very complicated global supply chains, which could be disrupted if the wrong type of weather event was to ensue. Also food security. So I've mentioned food. I'm trying to get them into the mindset of thinking what we could do to address that. So we could collaborate with other public sector partners, for example, to stockpile non-perishable food goods. So looking at canned goods, grains, dry food that will keep long term, because at the moment we're very reliant on frozen foods within the NHS, and a lot of other public sector bodies are too. And then I think the mental health dynamic is often overlooked as well. So if people start to experience damage to their properties, flooding becomes more prevalent, maybe their houses become uninsurable, unmortgageable, then again, there's going to be a dynamic that comes into play around that too. But I won't go into any more detail on this slide. So if you don't mind moving on, please. So in terms of what we're doing specifically within my trust and the wider NHS, so each trust has to have a green plan. Ours is called the My Green Plan because Mid Yorkshire, my acronym is used a lot for obvious reasons. It's just quite neat and yeah, it's part of the brand, I suppose. So this is the second iteration. So each one has to be 3 years in terms of focusing each trust on the near term, so that it don't. If it was a 20-year strategy and plan, then obviously you would become complacent. So the idea is that you hone in on what you need to do in the short term, and it's thematic. It covers all the bases. It's very holistic, but I would say the focus is on carbon abatement and mitigation, although there is a chapter We made sure that there was a chapter for climate adaptation, and we also look at biodiversity enhancement around nature-based solutions as well. In terms of the NHS as a whole, it was quite nascent up until a year or so ago, but they've worked with some organizations like Sniffer and We Adapt to produce some functional tools. So we do have a climate change risk assessment spreadsheet now, which we all use. And you'll see there's the front cover of the third adaptation report. We're now onto the fourth, which isn't a glossy publication, which is why I chose this picture. But it's a good document, but it's all very much in the planning stage at the moment, I would say, which is where the weakness lies. Next slide, please. So this is a table that's been extracted from the Green Plan. So this is from the climate adaptation chapter, just to show the actions that we've chosen over the next 3 years. So there's going to be a review, which is ongoing at the moment, actually, of all of our BCPs to make sure that they are fully reflective of the risks that we have. And actually, we also have a principal risk, one of only 8 organizational principal risks, which is on our board assurance framework. So that invites quite heavy scrutiny from the leadership team, the execs within the trust. And I have to compile a response and a report for that on a quarterly basis, which I think is good because, you know, you want that constructive criticism around what you're doing. And that risk is about failing to meet the net zero target and also failing to adapt to climate impacts as well. We're doing our vulnerability assessment, which is close to completion, and then that's going to feed into a plan, a strategy and a plan, and it's going to be a 10-year action plan that we look at, and that will help to articulate the things that we think need to happen, particularly across the estate in terms of those localized impacts, and hopefully we'll be able to put a case forward for the types of investment that we need to see. In terms of overheating, we actually have a duty under something called ERIC, which is the estate's return of information collection that's annual. We're meant to be reporting instances of any clinical area that's gone above 26 degrees Celsius in any given day. We haven't been doing that to the fullest effect possible, and that was due to a deficiency with our building management systems, where we were not collating and trending that information, which is something that I've now rectified. So we should have that visibility from this year onwards. And then I've also been looking at water as well, because we don't actually have very good capacity, especially at one of the hospitals, in the event of something going dreadfully wrong. So yeah, they're the near-term things we're looking at, but I also do want to look at some of those other things around the bigger picture as well. It's just convincing people as to the importance of those things. Next slide, please. So I probably covered some of this already, but climate risk is here to stay. It's locked in effectively. There's always latency within the climatic system. So even if you turned off carbon emissions overnight, which obviously isn't going to happen, you'd still be feeling the effects for decades to come, really. And again, I don't think people fully understand that within estates teams and facilities teams and corporately within organizations as well. Obviously, the buildings that we have at our disposal were not designed for a different climate. We have a mishmash estate, really. So the PFI buildings are newer, they're more thermally performant, but we do have older stock as well, especially at the Dewsbury site. And it's really difficult to make those more thermally performant because we don't have the money to make those changes. And when you look at things like external wall insulation, it's very costly, but the paybacks are very long as well. So it's really difficult to make that argument. Like I said, data is quite poor, and I'm sure there are other climate change impacts manifesting themselves and costing us money. For example, tarmac highways are probably deteriorating faster than they would, pipe work being damaged, and so on and so forth, and also pluvial runoff as well. So we don't have any fluvial problems in terms of rivers, etc., but we have had, localized flooding in terms of runoff. I do think system thinking is lacking at the moment. So we're looking at one or two hazards in isolation and not joining up the dots. Also, when it comes to sustainability and net zero in general, it's often seen as a nice to have, maybe a bit of lip service, but we can't really afford to do that with this, because if our buildings fail to perform, then our clinicians can't do their jobs and patients ultimately suffer. And then that last point is around the fact that we don't really know what future to prepare for, because I don't know if many of you have seen the fact that it's been in the news recently that I'm going to attempt to say this, the AMOC, which is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current, is weakening. And there's very robust, credible science that's saying that's the case. And if it does happen, the Gulf Stream will weaken, which means that actually Britain becomes colder rather than hotter by 4 degrees Celsius on average annually, and rainfall patterns affected as well. So it's how do you plan ahead for those two very different eventualities? And then last slide, please, which is about the funding gap. So most public sector bodies now are under immense pressure financially, and organizations in general. But in terms of that financial landscape, it's really difficult to get investment. And like I said earlier, a business case that's quite intangible is probably not going to be viewed upon favorably. So we really do need to get better at conceptualizing that data and quantifying the levels of risk, really. But mindful of time, so I'll probably leave it at that, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Very comprehensive overview there of the truly global risks that climate change brings, and the mitigations that we can have in place in order to meet those challenges. We have a couple of questions in already, but just a reminder for delegates on the call, please do use this opportunity to pick our experts' brains here. And whilst you're doing that, I know we talked about the Atlantic conveyor current there, and the uncertainty of projections moving forward for climate. But there's been a couple of questions in around the cooling point that I think you raised earlier, Peter. So there's a question here: given that there is still no legal maximum temperature for workplaces, how do you strike the balance between cooling options and staff tolerant to heat? Yeah, the person here says, their site relies on natural ventilation, but they need a more substantial cooling option. And Peter, I know in your case as well, you're dealing with vulnerable individuals, medically vulnerable individuals, as well as elderly people and very young people. So staff tolerance to the heat, as you say, ice lollies can only go so far. Are there any examples you have where you have brought in sort of cooling into a legacy estate where it's more sort of natural ventilation?
I think one of the things that we're looking at the moment is that if we're doing a decarbonisation project around electrification of heat, making sure that any heat pumps we choose have got a hybrid capability where they can also provide cooling in reverse mode, because that helps to sort of future-proof the estate where you're able to do that. So there are a couple of instances where we've been able to do that so far, but generally not with the older buildings. And actually there's a bit of a dichotomy as well, because in the PFI estate we continually have to send out messaging during a heat wave not to open windows, because that works against the BMS and the cooling capability and can compound the issue, whereas staff working at the older site are encouraged to open windows to get through drafts. So it's really difficult to get that messaging right, because it's quite confusing. And then one other thing is tree planting to give natural shade. It's very difficult to establish trees at the moment. So we planted a hedgerow, 5,000 trees around the Pinderfield site for a variety of different reasons, not necessarily climate adaptation, but of those trees, something like 50% have perished due to the really unusual drought conditions over the last 2 years. And then another building, our HQ building at Pinderfield, is flanked by very mature ash trees, but they're heavily affected by ash dieback, and they're going to have to be felled in the next few years from a health and safety perspective. So some of us are going to lose mature trees due to changes in disease vectors and dynamics. So it's tricky balance to strike.
No, completely. And I know that the biophilic and the biodiversity responses are always the more preferable ones, but that was a wrinkle I hadn't really considered up until now, Peter. So thank you. Anna, patiently waiting with your hand up.
Thank you. Just as a nod to the complex sites and stakeholders that Peter's dealing with there in the NHS, and the temperature and indoor air climate is hyper personalized, isn't it? It's so specific. You're dealing with people who are maybe non-ambulant or still most of the time and rely on warmer conditions, ambient temperature and so on. And I am just reminded that as in warmer climates, the reverse with air conditioning can be true as well. So to be outside, outdoors in a commute from your car to your place of work, and it's humid and it's 40 degrees and so on, and then you come into a cool air conditioned building, oftentimes those indoor occupants report of being just very uncomfortable. You know, you're warm and wet outside, and then you're cold and sticky inside, and you have to work like that all day, and it doesn't support work really and productivity, and so it's going to always be a difficult balance to strike.
Thank you, Anna. Another point here, maybe James perhaps want to pick up here. I'm not sure we have the answer, but they were highlighting looking after some community colleges, especially with that using PFI to get those constructed. There was an opportunity for photovoltaic to be built into the fabric of the building, flat roofs. Obviously, then you've got some low carbon on site power production, but there's again, it's the ROI argument, isn't it, about setting out how this initial capital outlay can have that return. James, do you have any sort of tools or techniques that are able to structure those conversations around a return on investment?
Well, I think like it's critical these days that yes, we want to ensure that we are seeing a return on investment, maybe from a financial perspective, but it is really about like how much of a return by implementing these measures can you get from a productivity perspective and a well-being of your staff perspective and their health and their enjoyment of coming into those office spaces or those working spaces where they feel comfortable, because ultimately over a long period of time that will improve your reputation as well. So I think it's really important to consider our people. I also think that, like, going back to the previous point around sort of like the heat piece, and I think it's really going to play into sort of our consumption of water for cooling, for like water to keep hydrated well into the future as well. So we as a whole society, I think, really need to start analyzing our relationship with water as not just as a resource, but sort of how we treat it. And I think that's going to be a really important challenge going forward as well.
100%. I know the UN at the beginning of the year put out a paper around water bankruptcy globally and domestically as well. And I think that was a very useful lens to view that challenge through. And it speaks to what you said there, James. Peter, coming to you as well, just on that ROI and sort of robust business development case point. Appreciate in a public body that an already challenging process becomes even more challenging. So I appreciate you've set out these strategies, but how on a day to day as working with your FM provider, do you work with that to try and ensure that you are getting not only the best value for money, but sustainable and resilient responses?
Yeah, I mean, we have managed to bring in £10.5 million worth of external funding into our organisation to look at decarbonisation projects specifically. I think sometimes the frustration in the public sector in particular is that the timescales attributed to some of those schemes are very short. So from a delivery perspective, it's quite difficult to to get those things over the line in terms of the funding conditions. So, for example, delivering a solar scheme, a major rooftop solar scheme in 12 months is difficult because you have to engage with the distribution network operator. You have to go through planning, even if it's permitted development, just to check through things. You have to do multiple surveys. The REBA stage process takes a long time. So it's a difficult quandary, I think. We haven't done a big business case yet when it comes to climate adaptation specifically, because I don't think solar is really adaptation. It's more mitigation. It is resilience from an energy security perspective because you're less reliant on electricity import onto the site. So that there's definitely additional selling points that you can put into a business case around some of those things. But for example, cooling, there is no return on investment. It's a cost. It's a complete sunk cost. And you can argue that it has to happen because you need that cooling to make the building safe to use for the occupants. But there is no business case. It's from somewhere you're going to have to find that money. And there's going to be no funding available in the public sector for something like that. So you've got to find that money in an increasingly difficult scenario when it comes to budgets.
And James, this is where, as a service provider, they can add that value in terms of the solutions they're providing and really help address the issues that an estate is facing, like Peter's, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we obviously provide our clients, our partners through various different types of schemes. We're very heavily in sort of the PFI space, but yes, we have done several sort of risk assessments, analysis when it has come to climate adaptation. But I think Peter is probably right to a point that like very large business cases for adaptation probably aren't quite there within the UK yet, and it's something that we definitely need to work more with on, as well as that sort of going to the right sort of people within central government to prove to them that actually funding mechanisms for this type of work would be really, really useful for the public sector going forward as well. So there's definitely a sort of a piece where we're at the beginning of our journey, and I think that like this is definitely being recognized when you look at some of the tenders that are coming out as well. Climate risk and adaptation, there are starting to be more requirements within those long-term FM agreements. So that's really good that it is being recognized. We probably need an injection of cash into some real demonstrators that are larger than a project here and a project there. We need to do something much more at scale within our estates because they are aging rapidly.
Yeah, and to have that thought leadership at that scale as well will spark innovation and best practice elsewhere. Fantastic. Just a final question now, and then I'll go to each panelist for a sort of key takeaway from today. That delegates on this call, what can they take away as their lunch hour draws to a close and really start implementing? So whilst panelists are thinking of that, Anna, if I could just quickly come to you for a real quick question around the sort of dual challenges around climate adaptation and climate mitigation and climate adaptation in terms of the curriculum. Do you think we're there yet in the built environment?
No, nowhere near. There are some gaps that it's on us to address in academia. You heard me say earlier, I'm a big supporter of the FM being the Chief Sustainability Officer. There isn't a part of the organisation that the FM doesn't see. But we've had REBA Stage 0, we've got government soft landings, we've got the playbook, we've got a lot of information out there already, and somehow it's not landing and it's not being operationalised and implemented. And this is where we need to really ensure that we're listening to the right information, we're accessing the right information, we're asking serious questions, we're being discerning, we're being strategic enough in ourselves to know that we need to resist this becoming some sort of existential, overwhelming elephant to eat, and we remind ourselves that we need to eat it one piece at a time. So I'm reminded of Mark Carney's statement last week, and I'm going to paraphrase it now and probably butcher it, but he was applauding and acknowledging the small, meaningful actions done by the many. And on that graph, you'll always get the early adopters doing the big things, putting the peanut oil, CHP in, and you're getting your high level certification schemes. But actually, if we're going to deal with our vast, sprawling, complex estate in a complex global environment at the moment, we just need to make a start. So go back to the guide, have a look at what that means for you, and see what you can begin to advocate for change on. And then the funding will come, and then the actions will come. And we at university need to engage with you all to see how we turn out the FMs of the future.
Fantastic, Hannah, and thank you for putting your 1 minute, your little call to action in there at the end of your response as well. Very efficient. James, what's the one key takeaway or the one piece of advice that you would like delegates to take away from this call?
It sort of rhymes certainly with what Anna was saying. I mean, like, I do think that education is needed, but like, we also need to be responsible for that education. So the knowledge you do have and retain, can you pass that down into your supply chain? Can you kind of tell them this is how we do things around here? So like, let's work on it together. Let's develop together. But I suppose that if we're thinking about it from an individual perspective, like in terms of what we do, our tasks, our operations, if we keep asking ourselves this specific action right now, what is the relevance to climate risk? What is the relevance to climate adaptation in a piece of work I'm doing now? And then we'll just start thinking about it, and it'll become part of the way we're doing things, almost through a bit of osmosis. So like a bit more of a personal target, I suppose, but I think one that everybody should just be cognizant of in the back of their minds.
No, that's really important, that behavioral change, getting it embedded in your day to day, and you will be doing it reflexively then and more effectively. Peter, last but by no means least, a takeaway for folks on the call today.
Yeah, I think all of us understand the high level risks now, but what we need to see are worked examples of what it actually means in practice, site specific wise. So something to help us calculate the avoided costs from taking action proactively. I think that's what you want to see now. So if you put wooden solar shades on the side of a building, what's that going to actually mean? And, you know, is there a fire risk? Are you still going to be able to insure the building? All of those practical things that you need to understand around some of those more passive, low regrets type packages of options, which I don't think we quite have yet. So I just like to see more financial business case examples actually of how we go about implementing some of these things, turning the theory into practice. Basically, I think we've done the theory, now we need to do the practice.
What a brilliant note to end on. Thank you so much, Peter, and the panel more broadly. Colleagues on the call, I'm sure you'll join me in thanking our panel and their contributions today. Really quickly, in the closing moments, the guidance can be downloaded from the QR code there from the IWFM website. And it will be on the front page there as well. So just give you folks a moment there. We also have just released this week in timing coinciding with Earth Day, recycling, waste and resource management, which is a adjacent issue to sustainability and climate resilience as well. So that is a piece of guidance that's hot off the press, and we'll be talking more about that in a webinar next month. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. We're also delighted that we're working. We work with Equans on our 2025 sustainability report. And again, the findings of this report really did help inform the guidance notes. So it's almost like a companion piece to today's guidance and something to reflect upon to see the scale of the challenge and how the sector is feeling. And yes, we do have good practice guides. We have reports and discussion notes, articles in Facilitate, as well as the good practice guides we put out here today. And I believe we have
upcoming courses as well, speaking to the education part through the IWFM Academy, looking at those environmental sustainability skills and those pathways to net zero. Please don't worry if you haven't had time to scan the QR codes. These slides will be sent out, so you have that opportunity afterwards, as well as the various member benefits there as well. So in closing, thank you so much for your time. Apologies, we went 1 minute over. You can say it was my fault to whoever meeting you're going to next. There is your CP number for today's event, and I would like to draw the webinar to a close. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.